One day the Republic may have to cry. Mark is an extraordinary case. Mark is neither an enemy nor a friend of the Republic. Mark was neither a friend nor an enemy of the dictatorship. Mark was neither a friend nor an enemy of the monarchy. Mark is a friend or enemy of no one. Mark is Mark. Mr. Mark, under this new regime, is in the same position as he was during the monarchy, and either the Republic subdues him or he subdues the Republic. End quote. With these prophetic words, Finance Minister Jaume Carner warned the deputies on June 14, 1932, about the need to stop the richest man in Spain in his tracks. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in this third installment of the biographical series on Juan March Cortinas, I will explain the war he waged against the left-wing governments of the Second Republic and his prison escape worthy of a Hollywood movie. And of course I will go into detail about how, without Marx's money and connections, it would have been impossible for Franco's rebel faction to win the Spanish Civil War and establish a brutal dictatorship, as well as how this merchant of death became one of the richest men in the world by profiting from the war that devastated Spain. Juan March was deeply unsettled during the final 2 years of King Alfonso XIII's monarchy, trying to predict Spain's political future. In August 1930, right-wing Republicans Miguel Maura and Alejandro Lerroux tried to persuade March to fund an uprising for a movement that would combine a general strike and a military coup, aiming to establish a liberal democratic republic. However, the billionaire from Mallorca refused to support the Republican cause, something the left will never forgive. In the end, and much to the Republicans' own surprise, the Republic was proclaimed on April 14, 1931, following their municipal election victory and the withdrawal of support from the monarchy from political, economic, and military elites. Just 2 weeks later, Interior Minister Miguel Maura ordered March's arrest as he was preparing to flee to France. Maura urged the new Attorney General, Ángel Galarza, to investigate whether dictator Primo de Rivera had illegally granted March a tobacco monopoly in Ceuta and Melilla without a public tender. A spoiler, he had, as we discussed in the previous episode, linked in the description using the playlist. In June 1931, Finance Minister Indalecio Prieto revoked the monopoly. Legal proceedings were opened, but the presiding judge dropped the case and, nearly in tears, told the Attorney General that pursuing March would ruin his judicial career. To shield himself with parliamentary immunity, March ran in the June constituent elections and was elected as a deputy for Mallorca with his centrist Liberal Party. But Attorney General Galarza made imprisoning Juan March one of his main objectives. March was an icon of capitalism and corruption, a price catch for the new political regime. If a millionaire like March could end up in jail, people might truly believe change had come and a political revolution had taken place. However, the Supreme Court was still filled with judges appointed during the Bourbon Restoration and the Primo de Rivera dictatorship, and they refused to prosecute either figures from the dictatorship or March over the Ceuta and Melilla concession case. With the legal route blocked, the fight shifted to the political arena. In August, the government created the Commission of Responsibilities through a controversial law that Prime Minister Manuel Azaña later privately admitted was unconstitutional. This was a political tribunal that violated the separation of powers between the legislative and judicial branches, intended to prosecute military officers, politicians, and businessmen tied to the former regime. March defended himself however he could. He had allies in Lerroux's Radical Party sitting on the commission who fed him updates on the investigation's progress. He tried to bribe the president of the subcommittee investigating him, and Galarza received word that March was planning to have him assassinated to intimidate the rest and shut the case down. March also funded right-wing media articles claiming that the tobacco concession in Ceuta and Melilla had been handed to a French company whose management was disastrous. He even used corrupt tactics to block tobacco deliveries to Melilla and apply pressure to get the monopoly returned to him. But nothing worked. In Azaña's words, March seemed like an old plucked rooster. Alejandro Lerroux wrote that everyone avoided contact with him. Despite being the richest man in Spain, he was seen as a political corpse destined for prison. No one wanted to associate with him and risk their own political careers. And so it went. On June 15, 1932, Parliament voted to strip Mark of his parliamentary immunity for bribery and incitement to corruption related to his dealings with the Primo de Rivera dictatorship. That same day, he was arrested and imprisoned in Madrid's Cárcel Modelo, where he remained in abusive pretrial detention for over a year. Mark felt deeply insulted and humiliated by being imprisoned despite the privileged treatment he received. He was given a large cell that was renovated to serve as an office where he met daily, often until late at night, with his associates. He didn't eat prison food. Meals were brought in from a restaurant. Prison staff treated him with excessive deference, as if he were their master. Unlike the other inmates, Juan March wasn't woken at 6:30 a.m., and he was visited daily by prostitutes to satisfy his sexual appetites. That said, the Commission of Responsibilities denied his request to be released from pretrial detention on health grounds, even though doctors confirmed that the Mallorcan suffered from medical conditions requiring hospital treatment. This clearly enraged him, and Mark became convinced, rightly so, that they wanted him to die behind bars. They let him rot in prison while investigative commissions stalled and lawmakers turned their attention to other, more pressing matters. But the richest man in Spain had many resources at his disposal to wage total war against the Republican state and reclaim his freedom. Conspiracies against the new regime had begun the very day the Republic was proclaimed, involving monarchies and assorted right-wing factions. Mark got involved in these conspiratorial talks and financed some of the earliest coup plots. For example, the director of Informaciones, the conservative newspaper owned by Mark, was one of the conspirators behind the failed Sanjurjada coup. And in fact, this journalist drafted the manifesto that Sanjurjo hoped would rally other military officers to his side. The Mallorcan banker even paid off debts for one of General Sanjurjo's sons and helped Alejandro Lerroux out of financial trouble. Lerroux, involved in the conspiracy himself, warned Azaña in July 1932 that an uprising could occur, claiming the government had lost popular support. One minister believed Lerroux's increasingly radical rhetoric was due to pressure and bribes from Mark. After Sanjurjo's failed coup, the Republican government used emergency powers to temporarily censor and seize right-wing newspapers like Informaciones, ABC, and El Debate. Mark had lost the military battle, but he continued to wage a media war against the Republican-Socialist coalition government. The press campaign began in his own newspapers. They pushed the narrative that Mark was being persecuted simply for not having funded the revolutionary insurrection that was supposed to bring about the Second Republic. The right tried to downplay the seriousness of his corruption, no surprise there, and accused the socialists of trying to build a myth of incorruptibility by unfairly punishing Mark. And to some extent, this was true. The left wanted to send a clear message that no matter how wealthy you were, you couldn't escape justice. After several months with no improvement in his situation, Mark made a generous payment to bring the right-wing newspapers into the smear campaign against the leftist government. But the most astonishing part is that Mark's journalists and monarchist allies even bribed the editor of the anarchist newspaper La Tierra to publish their articles. This led members of the anarcho-syndicalist CNT to rightly accuse La Tierra of taking money from reactionaries. It just goes to show that there are traitors to their supposed ideals everywhere, especially when corrupt money is involved. In 1933, the publishing group behind the major Republican newspapers El Sol, Luz, and La Voz was struggling financially because the government wouldn't let them raise prices. Their owner accepted a loan from Mark in exchange for joining the campaign against Manuel Azaña's government, hoping to force the socialists out and replace them with someone like Lerroux. Even prominent intellectuals like Ortega y Gasset and Azorín wrote pieces against Azaña. Dr. Gregorio Marañón, a close friend of Mark, even met with Azaña to offer a deal. Stop the media attacks in exchange for Mark's release. Totally normal for a doctor to act as a messenger for blackmail. Today, by the way, this guy has a hospital named after him in Madrid. It's mind-blowing. By mid-1933, the Mallorcan capitalists controlled nearly all of Madrid's press and used it to wear down the government. Madrid media working to undermine and destabilize a mildly leftist government? That sounds familiar with what has been happening lately in Spain. The only allies the government had left were El Heraldo de Madrid, El Liberal, and El Socialista. Marx's media crusade succeeded in weakening the Republican-Socialist coalition but failed in its main goal, buying his freedom. Frustrated at still being imprisoned, Marx planned a plot in the summer of 1933 to assassinate Prime Minister Manuel Azaña and Minister Indalecio Prieto, whom he saw as the main culprits behind his continued detention. Ultimately, though, nothing came of it. In September, elections were held in local councils to select members of the Court of Constitutional Guarantees. This wouldn't be worth mentioning here if it weren't for the fact that Marx was elected as a member in the Palma City Council. Mallorca was his stronghold, and by then the national right had turned a corrupt, murderous, and treasonous billionaire like Juan March into a martyr. The Republican and Socialist candidates were overwhelmingly defeated, which led to the collapse of the coalition government. Leroux formed a short-lived government with ministers who threatened to resign if Marx were released from his prolonged pre-trial detention. When it became clear that his case wouldn't be resolved through political, military, or media pressure, Spain's most notorious smuggler chose to escape from prison. General elections were scheduled from November 19, 1933. The Mallorcan tycoon financed the campaigns of the Radical Party, his own Republican Center Party in Mallorca, and the right-wing CEDA. However, it was unclear whether the right would win, and he was facing new legal cases, so he wasn't willing to leave his fate to the electoral outcome. That's why Juan March broke out of prison on November 3rd. Calling it an escape is debatable because he simply walked out the front door at 10 o'clock at night, and no prison official stopped him. It wasn't like he got his hands dirty digging a tunnel. He was jailed like a gentleman and left like one. His exit was arranged with the prison's head of service, who from that point on became a loyal servant. That official sent the front gate guard out to buy cigarettes just before March left. Though he was expelled from the force for his corruption, under Franco's dictatorship he was reinstated and eventually ran two prisons. March was also escorted by two gunmen provided by the FAI as repayment for various favors he had done for the anarchists, such as paying bails. March was also escorted by two gunmen provided by the FAI as repayment for various favors he had done for anarchists, such as paying bails. It appears the escape operation was organized by arms dealer and British Secret Service agent Basil Zakharov, and Marx's friendly contacts in Gibraltar helped him cross the border. Matilde Reig, Marx's lover, played a key role in the escape and acted as a liaison between British agents and Marx's collaborators. Once in Gibraltar, Marx quickly made press statements claiming political persecution and unjust treatment without evidence. A few days later, Marx left Gibraltar for Paris. There, he received treatment for his rheumatism, as his health was genuinely poor at the time. Some accused him of orchestrating a financial attack on the peseta from Paris, leading to a sharp devaluation. I found conflicting information on this point, but knowing how vengeful and treacherous he was, I wouldn't be surprised if he had indeed sabotaged his country's currency just to hurt the government and make money in the process. The right won the November 1933 elections mainly because the leftist parties had failed to meet workers' expectations of bold reforms, especially agrarian ones. The left also ran in fragmented slates, and the anarchists called for abstention, with accusations that this abstention campaign was funded by reactionary forces. Juan March headed the candidate list in Mallorca for his centrist Liberal Party and was elected with just over 100,000 votes. With parliamentary immunity and the Commission of Responsibilities disbanded, the billionaire returned to Spain in late March 1934. The bribery and tax evasion case against him was dismissed by a Supreme Court stacked with friends. With the right now in power, March stepped back from politics as his enemies were no longer in government pursuing him. He focused on managing his businesses from the Palace Hotel in Madrid. His time in prison had transformed the now 50-something-year-old March into a more reserved and distrustful man who stayed out of the public eye and used frontmen to hide the scale of his vast business empire. Nevertheless, in 1934, Galician journalist Manuel Benavides published the novel The Last Pirate of the Mediterranean. Although it didn't name March explicitly, it was clearly a fictionalized biography of the Mallorcan capitalist and a denunciation of corruption in Lerroux's party. March's henchmen went from bookstore to bookstore illegally seizing copies of the book, and the magnate threatened the publisher. Rumor has it he struck a deal to buy up most of the print run. Under Franco's regime, the book was banned, while in the Soviet Union it was a required reading for Spanish language students. When the October 1934 revolution broke out, Juan March donated 100,000 pesetas to the army to help suppress the workers. Shortly afterward, he sold his moderate-left newspaper, La Libertad, seeing that Spain was so polarized it no longer made sense to play both sides. He had already dropped the pretense of being a capitalist concerned for workers. A year later, he also sold Informaciones, his conservative newspaper and a propaganda outlet for the Nazis in Spain. This didn't mean he stopped using the media for his interests. He simply switched from owning newspapers to investing in publishing companies and funding targeted campaigns, allowing him to operate more anonymously. That discretion didn't prevent growing paranoia about his influence. For example, in the Socialist Party, there was a deep rift between the followers of Indalecio Prieto and those of Largo Caballero. The former accused the newspaper Claridad, controlled by Largo Caballero, of being financed by March's money. Whether those accusations were true or just slander is unknown. In any case, things were relatively quiet for Juan March during the Counter-Reformist Biennium, but by February 1936, new general elections were called and leftist parties formed a coalition, the Popular Front. After everything that had happened in the first biennium, reconciliation with the left was impossible for March. So it's no surprise that the richest man in Spain was the main financier of the right-wing campaigns in 1936. He was a lobbyist powerful enough to veto candidates, according to one deputy who wanted to run again in Murcia. He was essentially Spain's Elon Musk, but way smarter. The Popular Front parties accused March of giving orders to civil governors to commit electoral fraud in favor of the right and center parties. But March feared a leftist victory and the possibility of being imprisoned again, so this time he didn't run for office and took refuge in France. In his stronghold of the Balearic Islands, the right and center parties won amid accusations of electoral fraud, contrary to the national trend, which saw a victory for the Popular Front. In my Spanish channel, I've debunked the Franco myth that the leftist victory was fraudulent, so if you want me to cover this on this channel, let me know in the comments. Seeing they couldn't win through legal and democratic means, many on the right became convinced they had to seize power by force, accelerating and intensifying preparations for a military uprising. Meanwhile, over 1,000 peasant families occupied March's estates in Cádiz and Jaén. There was a major capital flight from wealthy Spaniards toward European and American banks. Most of the Mallorcan tycoons' fortune wasn't in physical assets, but in easily movable financial ones. So when the Civil War broke out, there was little the government could confiscate. March had already sold off much of his property in Spain in anticipation of the worst, ensuring he had liquid assets he could take abroad. Now it's time to discuss Juan March's vital role in the July 18th coup d'etat. As I've already mentioned, March had supported monarchist conspiracies from the beginning, including the failed 1932 Sanjurjo uprising. He funded the magazine Acción Española, whose reactionary writers advocated for a monarchist restoration via a provisional military dictatorship, justifying the right to take up arms against a government they labeled tyrannical. Starting in 1935, March began funding the fascist party Falange, using the Phalangists as cannon fodder against the left, and as support for a future military uprising if the left returned to power. Falange was not a mass movement. It was sustained by support from the wealthy and middle classes who feared communism and anarchism and were sympathetic to fascism. José Antonio Primo de Rivera, Falange's founder and son of dictator Miguel Primo de Rivera, loved to boast that one of the first things they should do if a right-wing coup succeeded would be to hang Juan March. Yet he had no qualms about taking his money. However, March's most significant contribution to the coup preparations was acting as banker for the plotters, using his vast reserves of foreign currency gained through his import-export businesses and banking operations. He utilized bank accounts in London, Geneva, New York, Rome, and London to channel funds, both in the lead-up to and during the war. A key player in this story was the London-based Kleinworth Bank, of which Mark was one of his top clients and shareholders. Through Kleinworth, Mark secured a loan of £500,000 British pounds for the right-wing conspirators in March 1936. The rebel officers needed modern weaponry to gain the upper hand, and turned to Italy for it. Mark acted as the go-between, paying with foreign currency since the peseta could not be converted without government approval. On July 1st, thanks to this arrangement, the conspirators signed preliminary contracts with Mussolini to purchase bombers, fighter planes, and other military gear worth the equivalent of €464 million in 2024. We will soon see just how crucial this was to the rebels, but another key contribution by Mark was funding the rental of the British airplane the Dragon Rapide, that flew Franco from the Canary Islands to Morocco to take command of the Army of Africa. After the Popular Front 1936 election victory, Mark and many other conspirators relocated to a town in southwestern France. There, Mark offered to care for the families of the generals involved in the planned coup, all of whom accepted and sent their wives and children there in case things went wrong. The moment of truth arrived on July 18, 1936, the date set for the military uprising. The day before, Mark ordered some captains of his shipping company, Transmediterranea, to set sail and await further instructions. When the coup began, they docked at ports controlled by the rebel military. The Transmediterranea vessels that weren't seized by the Republicans were used to supply and transport troops. The rebels faced a major obstacle. The Spanish Navy remained largely loyal to the Republic. Yet somehow they had to transport the Army of Africa, Spain's most seasoned soldiers and Moroccan colonial troops, to the mainland. That's where Juan March's powerful influence came in. He funded German and Italian aircraft, which gained air supremacy over the Strait of Gibraltar in August, and enabled the first large-scale airlift of soldiers in world history from Morocco to Seville. Simultaneously, Mark used his Transmediterranean fleet and his seasoned smuggling network to slip past Republican naval patrols, moving men and weapons under cover of fascist air power. Without the ability to transport the Army of Africa, the rebel generals would have been crushed like bugs within weeks. In short, without Juan March, Franco's dictatorship would never have existed. And this was just one of many crucial ways the tycoon aided the coup. Early in the uprising, in a Rome hotel, Mark crossed paths with Torquil River, the pro-Nazi president of the American oil company Texaco. River immediately telegrammed 5 tankers en route to Spanish refineries, redirecting them to rebel-held ports and assuring them payment, guaranteed by Juan March. That's the kind of influence this man wielded. Texaco, the main supplier of oil to CAMSA, Spain's state-owned oil company, cut off the Republic in November 1936 and aligned itself fully with Franco's forces. But Texaco alone couldn't meet rebel field demands. Mark's associates bought fuel in Portugal and from Shell in Tangier, and Mark also sourced oil and supplies in France, rerouting them to Tangier for delivery to Franco's forces. Historian Ángel Viñas has announced he will publish a book in 2025 presenting new evidence about rebel fuel sources, with Mark as a key figure. I will definitely be making a video on it, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. From Paris, Mark funded a campaign in the French conservative press and other international outlets to sway public opinion against the Popular Front government in France, providing aid to the Spanish Republic. He also influenced the French Radical Socialist Party, part of the governing coalition where he had allies, to support a non-intervention stance. For Spain's Republicans and leftist forces, Juan March became the very embodiment of the betrayal by the country's capitalist class against the people's democratic will. In Portugal, March helped set up the rebel embassy and coordinated logistics to receive German and other foreign weaponry, as the rebels used Portugal as a supposedly neutral intermediary. In August, Franco submitted a shopping list of aircraft, but the Italians, doubtful of rebel success, demanded cash up front. Only Mark had the liquidity to meet that demand, securing a £10 million credit line through Kleinworth Bank. He also backed the purchase of thousands of trucks from Ford and General Motors. Meanwhile, the infamous arms dealer Basil Sakharov, the same man who had helped Mark escape from prison, was selling obsolete and defective weapons to the Republic. In May 1937, Mark and the Duke of Alva visited Mussolini and persuaded him not to withdraw Italian troops, despite French pressure for non-intervention. In every sense, Juan March was the rebels' top guarantor and fixer. The French communist newspaper, L'Humanité, wasn't wrong when it asked, quote, "Is there anyone in the rebel camp who has done more for fascism than the pirate Juan March?" End quote. Before diving into March's role as the rebels' chief financier, let's look at his part in defending his stronghold, Mallorca. There the coup succeeded almost without resistance. But from Catalonia, a Republican expedition reconquered Ibiza and Formentera and landed in Mallorca on August 17, 1936. The Catalan air and naval forces were superior, so the island's defense commander turned to March for help. The capitalists quickly paid for 3 Italian fighter planes, seaplanes, and anti-aircraft batteries, which broke enemy air superiority and secured the skies. The Republican operation ended in a major disaster. Italy established an air base in the Balearics as a forward position in anticipation of a future world war, ensuring control of the Mediterranean against France. With the Italian expedition came Count Rossi, a fascist known for violent repression and political assassinations. He trained local fascists in his methods and unleashed a reign of terror across Mallorca, killing as many Reds as possible. Among the victims was Antoni Maria Gués, son of Marx's former business partner of the same name, who had joined Azaña's party. Once again, I want to emphasize the idea that without the money and connections of Juan March, the military uprising could never have succeeded. This was especially true during its most critical moments, namely the planning of the coup and the first 6 months of the war, because very few banks or financiers were willing to take the huge risk of lending money to the rebels. It wasn't until 1937 that the traitors to Spain began to reduce their dependence on March, thanks to battlefield victories, war spoils, forced contributions, and the increased ease of securing loans as their victories seemed more likely. Just days after the war broke out, the billionaire showed up at General Smola's headquarters in Pamplona and delivered a document detailing the foreign currency, gold, real estate assets, and international stocks he was putting at the service of the rebels as collateral to buy weapons. The amount totaled 600 million pesetas, an extraordinary sum that represented approximately 2% of Spain's 1935 GDP. It was a risky bet, but financing a war also brings great rewards, especially for those who back the winning side. Estimates of Marx's fortune at the time vary widely, from 1.2 billion to 4 billion pesetas, the latter figure equivalent to over 10% of Spain's 1935 GDP. The son of General Cabanellas, who became a historian, estimated that Marx invested 1 billion pesetas in the war, though the opaque nature of his fortune and operations makes exact numbers hard to pin down. In mid-August 1936, Marx was forced to leave France due to pressure from the French government and communists and relocated to Rome to be closer to his friends in fascist Italy. Between August and September, Marx deposited 5.5 tons of gold in the Kleinworth Bank and 178.7 tons from Banca March in the Bank of Italy, when Italy's central bank had only 240 tons in reserve the year before. Spain's central bank held around 700 tons of gold, one of the largest reserves in the world. That a single individual like Juan March could mobilize more than a quarter of that amount shows the sheer scale of his wealth. This gold deposit in Italy facilitated the purchase of weapons, including tanks and submarines. In just over 2 months, March paid in cash and credit for more than 100 aircraft from the Italian firm Savoia Marchetti. To maximize profits and control, the Mallorcan banker became the majority shareholder in that company. On March 14, 1937, the Burgos government ordered all citizens under his control to declare and hand over all gold, foreign currency, and foreign securities to finance the war. in return, the state will compensate them in pesetas at the official exchange rate. On the international markets, Mark converted these assets into collateral for loans. In this way, he not only acted as a banker using his own fortune, but also served as a financial middleman for the rebels in credit operations and currency exchanges. Just days before this decree, Franco addressed Republican media criticism of the rebels' funding with these words, quote, "In our ranks, we fight for the true and new Spain, a Spain without class struggle or economic or caste privileges. Those who have lent their support to our movement, like Juan March, have not done so to seek favors which were never promised. They had done so in pursuit of a better Spain and contribute their share for a more just Spain." End quote. Juan March must have laughed at himself because he was making a fortune from the war. Juan March was a merchant of death, someone who had already profited from World War I and the colonial war in Morocco, and the Spanish Civil War was no exception. In 1943, a London newspaper ranked March as the 7th richest man in the world, suggesting that the Mallorcan had made enormous profits from the war. One major way he made money was through banking. The clever banker wasn't giving the rebels money as a gift. He financed them with loans that he expected to be repaid, with interest. During the war itself, March had already started calling in some debts, which greatly upset many generals and phalangists. On April 1st, 1939, the day the war officially ended, Franco signed a secret law, not made public until 1979, recognizing the debts incurred by the rebels as public debts. This, of course, included Marx. It's very easy to get into debt when you know others, including the losers of the war, will pay for it. By late 1939, due to Britain's liquidity needs during World War II, the Kleinworth Bank demanded repayment for a loan worth the equivalent of about 70 million euros in 2024. When they couldn't collect or transfer the debt to the Bank of England, Kleinworth sold it to a shell company in Geneva that Marx had created specifically for this purpose. Later, in 1945, Spain acquired the loan securities to repay citizens for the assets they had pledged during the war. This operation was surely just one of many in which Marx made a hefty profit. Another major money maker for the billionaire was the tobacco trade, which at the time was almost as essential for soldiers as food. However, perhaps Marx's biggest business during the Civil War was his near-total and monopolistic control over the foreign trade of nationalist Spain. As a reward for his financial support and for having a shipping company and international contacts, he was put in charge of purchasing war supplies, oil, and other materials essential for the army. This arms trade earned him massive profits. In fact, Marx reached an agreement with Mussolini to create a joint venture known as Safni, which operated as a monopolistic intermediary between Italy and Spain. Besides being a front company used to mask Italian arms exports, Safni also allowed the Italians access to strategic raw materials like tungsten, zinc, lead, and copper. The Mallorcan magnate profited twice over, exporting Spanish products to obtain foreign currency to buy more weapons and supplies, and then depositing those foreign funds in overseas banks. The war ended with a fascist victory, and thus Jaume Carner's prediction came true. Since the Republic didn't subdue Juan March, he ended up destroying it. One can't help but wonder if the Republican-Socialist government hadn't jailed him or jeopardized his economic interests in Spain and North Africa, maybe March wouldn't have supported a coup, and Spanish history could have taken a different course. Or perhaps they should have followed the advice of Indalecio Prieto, who once shouted in Congress in 1931 that the first thing the Republic should have done was hang Juan March in the Puerta del Sol of Madrid. That wraps up today's episode. Please like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and leave a comment if this story blew your mind. Consider supporting my work at patreon.com/newhistoryspain to get exclusive benefits like early access to all my content, appearing in the credits, and receiving exclusive merch. You can also make a donation and join the Discord to stay up to date. All links are in the description. In the next episode in this biographical series on Juan March, I will cover his role as an intermediary in the British espionage operation to bribe Franco generals and ministers to prevent Spain from joining the Axis in World War II. Thanks for watching and see you next time!